Hi everyone, welcome back to our business ethics class. So today we'll firstly talk about the ethics of workspace. I want to open with a case study. So when we talk about what kind of problems or issues we might have in the workspace, so one of the most significant ones would be sexual harassment. The second ethical problem that arose in this case study was related to immigration issues and the undocumented population. And the third problem or issue was controversial hiring practices. So things like this are what we try to address when we talk about the business ethics of workspace. So we talk about different models, tools, theories, or frameworks. And we also talk about different strategies and resources that might help us address this kind of issues and also to prevent and this kind of issues. Okay, so let's dive deeper into this concept of business ethics of workspace. So when we think of a workspace, the first thing that we will have to think about would be employment relationships. So I'd like to talk about those kind of concepts or doctrines that's related to employment relationships. And I want to get us kind of started with thinking about the kind of ethical implications of this. So the first is called due process. So due process is a kind of process that protects employees from arbitrary use of authority. So just as courts must follow rules when exercising power, employers should act fairly when hiring, firing, or disciplining employees. And the second is employment at will, so EAW. So this doctrine allows employers to terminate employees at any time for any reason or no reason, unless prohibited by law. So firstly, I think it's important to know these two concepts because as long as you talk about the ethics of workspace, those concepts would be something that you essentially will come across. And we can also get started about thinking about these two concepts as well. So the first is, so a lot of people find this concept of EAW problematic. So they think it's kind of inherently unfair, and they think this leads to injustice and oppression. So some argue that maybe employers should justify their actions to avoid exploiting this power imbalance or to avoid exploiting like people or workers. The second is about due process. So if we adopt due process, sometimes that can create a tension with having flexibility with like management or HR and stuff. So there is the tension there. So how do we balance that kind of tension? How do we do due process while still being able to have some flexibility with managing an HR? At the same time, there are, of course, ethical justifications for EAW. So there are some utilitarian justification and about like how we can use resources more wisely. There's also this discussion about property rights, and people think EAW justifies and kind of it's compatible with this idea of property rights. And at the same time, there are, of course, a lot of critiques of EAW. So firstly, you might be able to imagine that Marxist philosophers or ethicists hate the idea of EAW. So some people are, of that train might argue that EAW creates power imbalance, that it essentially gives more power to the employers and could potentially lead to exploitation of employees. And also, the idea of arbitrary dismissal is also one of the reasons why EAW is critiqued. So people argue that without due process, employees might be unfairly dismissed for reasons unrelated to their performance or behavior. So if they didn't have a duty to justify their decisions of hiring or firing, sometimes maybe what's actually going on is discrimination or stuff like that. And also legal exceptions, including discrimination laws, labor laws, and implied contracts, also are not compatible with the idea of EAW. So I think at this point you can already see the tension between EAW and due process. And I think this is an ethical question or a problem, maybe, that's worth considering and working on. So different moral philosophers and different ethical frameworks and different ethical decision-making models will have different answers and inclinations towards either EAW or the due process. So there is a tension here, and this might be something we want to be aware of when we think about and work with like employment relationships in the context of working on business ethics. So the next topic that might arise in the topic of business ethics of workspace or workplace is about health and safety. So the first kind of notion that might arise a lot of times will be the intrinsic and instrumental value. So employees have intrinsic values as individuals, not just as means to productivity. But people also argue that there is instrumental value of keeping people healthy and safe. So there are two kinds of values associated with health and safety. So the other concept is called acceptable risk. So we have different economic realities and restrictions and other restrictions. So frequently it's not the case that we have perfectly, completely like not risky environments. So it's okay to have some levels of risk. So there is this concept of acceptable risk. So there can be risks in that environment or workplace as long as that's reasonable after evaluation. However, this doctrine we just talked about has some flaws. So it doesn't see employees' input as stakeholders. It considers health and safety to be negotiable rather than something that's kind of basic, fundamental rights that shouldn't change and shouldn't be negotiated no matter what. And you might be able to imagine that a Kantian philosopher might not like this. And it also assumes that all risks are voluntary. So for instance, it's assuming things like a male worker inhaling cotton dust is kind of choosing to avoid the risk, but they can't do that. They don't have a choice. So like a Marxist philosopher might have a lot of things to say here about people not having choice. So it seems that this doctrine or approach we just saw doesn't really recognize things like human rights, and it also makes a lot of simplifications or misassumptions that might actually lead to like misimagination of what it's actually like to be a worker, which will in turn lead to exploitation and those workers' rights and working conditions not being appropriately I would say evaluated, and their struggles within their lived experience and their working environment might not be addressed because we're oversimplifying a lot of things. I think this is one of the reasons why kind of choosing the right and model or kind of theoretical doctrine or approach for addressing workplace health and safety is very important, because the approach or doctrine or framework you work with will kind of define or limit or restrict what you see and what problems you recognize and what kind of things you treat as acceptable and not acceptable. And that will, in a lot of cases, change or determine the experiences of the people working in those environments. So I think it's very important to choose the approach and to really think about what kind of assumptions you're making. And I think sometimes simplified approaches or models or not examining our assumptions enough might actually lead to serious problems with health and safety there. So the next approach we talk about will be health and safety as market controlled. So the market controlled approach argues that health and safety standards in the workspace should emerge naturally from employer-employee negotiations rather than government intervention. So people who argue for this kind of approach thinks that the market-controlled approach allows employees to negotiate wages depending on the level of risks they want to accept. So if you have jobs that involve higher risks, you can have higher wages. So that gives employees more power. And also, people argue that this approach would create more optimal distribution of safety and income. People also argue that if employers fail to maintain reasonable safety standards, they will have legal liability, so that's not good for their benefits. And at the same time, if they fail to maintain proper safety standards for their workers, their employers will suffer more or do worse in their negotiations. So that is also a kind of way of holding employers accountable. This approach has been critiqued a lot. So firstly, the problem of imperfect labor market. So many workers don't have enough bargaining power to negotiate safer conditions. So especially in low-paying jobs, when alternatives are limited, or especially when the workers themselves suffer from certain kinds of underprivileges, and also workers may not know all the information. Sometimes there is also the first generator problems. So markets learn about risks by observing harm to the first group of exposed individuals. So those first generation workers won't be able to negotiate, and also they would be sacrificed. Can be linked back to the moral philosophers we talked about in previous units. So firstly, utilitarianists might start thinking about whether this approach maximizes overall well-being, only like sacrifice some first generation workers. If that's the only price, then maybe some utilitarianists would be fine with that. But more contemporary utilitarianists who adopt notions of human rights in their frameworks might not be fine with the market-controlled approach still, and also the ontology. So Kantian philosophers might think fundamental rights to workplace safety is not something that can be traded off. It's not something that we can negotiate, no matter like how much wage you give to a person. Like there is a kind of human rights, like human dignity or autonomy that you can't ignore. Approaches like feminist ethics or Marxist ethics that talk about inequality and oppression. So it might argue that this could perpetuate inequality or favoring privileged workers over marginalized groups. And of course, we can also think about what humanistic psychology might say. So they might say that like humans should not be alienated and they should be seen and recognized as humans. So they might not like approach like this. They might feel like a lot of basic needs and the dignity of humans are not recognized. Queer ethics might feel like this approach is against their beliefs too. So we can think about like how to evaluate this market control approach, like applying different moral philosophy frameworks, but also think about the ethical decision-making models we talk about in the previous units and see how they might say different things about the market controlled approach. Then we move on to the concept of diversity. This book, some benefits of diversity was talk about like improved innovation and creativity, better decision making, higher financial performance, and enhanced talent recruitment and retention. I think some Marxist philosophers might not like talking about like the benefits of diversity as if it's just producing kind of economic benefits for the business. So they might think that we should see like the rights of workers to have access to fair treatment, like no matter who they are. Care ethicists might say things like, diversity might help us to better foster caring relationship in that space, and people like utilitarianists might say diversity helps like maximizing overall happiness, because we will be living like a more tolerant like world or workspace. Kantian philosophers might say things like, so humans have like fundamental rights and they have like fundamental autonomy and dignity, like that no matter like who they are or what gender they are or what kind of like skin color they have. So they might think that the autonomy and kind of dignity of a person should be recognized regardless of what, and businesses and employers have duties to see all that and promote all that, like regardless of their employees' background. So moral philosophers might think diversity is important, but for like different reasons. Some might actually find a lot of problems with talking about diversity as if it's just good for the market. So they would be more focused on the persons. Like humanistic psychologists might feel like talking about like promoting diversity as if it's just good for the business kind of alienates people and not seeing like the humans like in there. And there are also challenges to diversity, efforts of fostering diversity. So there might be cultural conflicts that we have to address. There might be challenges regarding integration with corporate culture. There might be stereotyping and tokenism, and also resistance to change. So those are the challenges that we might face when we try to foster diversity in our workspace. And some of these are actually pretty chronic and very difficult to properly address. So if you are writing the final paper, one thing you might want to do would be to talk about the kind of resources and tools and strategies that we might have to address challenges like this. And some of the ethical frameworks and education of those moral philosophies might be one way, but some people might also think like those are not gonna work. So we were just talking about benefits of kind of like business benefits of fostering diversity. We've talked about why diversity is an appealing idea based on different moral philosophy. I think in the US, there are also like legal landscape that grounds the kind of promotion of diversity. So we have anti-discrimination laws, we have affirmative action programs. However, the kind of like legal scape and the kind of legal groundings and programs have also faced critiques. So there have been opponents of affirmative action who argue that it may lead to reverse discrimination or diminish moral by prioritizing diversity over merit. Proponents at the same time argue that affirmative action programs will address systematic barriers and creates opportunities for underrepresented groups. So I think this is linked to the distinction between like stakeholder and shareholder theory. I think this is also linked to what kind of moral philosophy you adopt. Like, do you evaluate, like, how much do you value like underprivileged groups, and how much do you care about that? And so there has been a lot of debates and going back and forth on this. So, like, I think a lot of like discussions or research could really help like diving deeper into this tension here. So if you are interested in writing a paper on this, you can also explore this tension here. I think there has been this discussion of like diversity and fairness and the tension between these. People have argued whether this actually exists. So some people argue that thinking diversity and fairness, this dichotomy, is basically already assuming things that are not so friendly to the underprivileged groups. So some people argue that fostering diversity itself is fairness. So what are you talking about by saying balancing diversity and fairness? So this depends on like how you view diversity and how you view this idea of fairness. So there are different ways to think about this tension, and to kind of find their own position, like in this landscape, different organizations, and also actually fostering diversity in ways that fit the kind of standards and understanding of fairness within their own institution or organization. Different organizations have done a lot of things, like fostering an inclusive culture, implementing training programs, tie metrics to diversity goals, encourage open communication, and things like that. And it's also been raised that so diversity is not just a moral imperative as well, it's also a strategic advantage. So like a lot of organizations do all these things not just because they are trying to think or doing things morally, they are also like doing this from business strategies point of view. The topic we're going to talk about would be workplace bullying, and this is actually very important. So on the one hand, this creates emotional abuse and different types of abuse. So this is itself harming dignity, autonomy, and things like that. And this also create like stress, fear, other negative emotions. These effects will not be just confined to this person bullied, but like everyone. And this create like a space of anxiety and low morale and things like that. So it's bad for like the community and for the working environment. People also argue that there is economic costs, and this hurts like reputation. This also hurts like the kind of working relationships in the community, which a lot of people argue would harm the organization and leads to acts of sabotage. For this unit, we are more talking about like these issues from the perspective of like a business strategy, or the kind of like benefits of the business, or how to like make it better for the organization. So like you might be able to see, a lot more philosophers might disagree with workspace bullying, but not for these reasons. And like business kind of like considerations also might concern with this idea of service economies. So like this concept addresses the idea that workplace bullying will be very problematic for service-based industries, because these roles will require a lot of interpersonal interactions. So workplace bullying will harm the business and the organization, like especially when it comes to service economies. People also have talked about like why work bullying happens. So they talk about personality clashes, kind of a psychology related to it. They also talk about like economic pressures and the kind of like pressures within the organization, things like that. So I think that's all I want to talk about for workspace business ethics. So I hope you've enjoyed the lecture, and see you in the next lecture.